Dámy a páni, milé kolegyne, kolegovia, tým myslím aj študentky a študentov. Ja vás vítam na ďalšom podujatí medzinárodnom cykle prednášok, celoživotnom cykle prednášok interdisciplinárnej dialógy Filozofickej fakulty Univerzity Konštantína v Nitre. Dnes máme vzácneho hostia, je to doktor James Bennett, prezident International Semiotic Institute, ktorý momentálne pôsobí v Čechách na Slovenskej univerzite, konkrétne na katedre všeobecnej lingvistiky. Ja skôr, než mu odozdám slovo, dovolte, aby som ho predstavil. James Bennett ukončil svoju štúdiu semiotiky na doktorátskom stupni aj filozofie na univerzite v Tartu v Estonsku, kde jeho školiteľom bol známy semiotik Kaleriku. Oblasťou, ktorými sa zaoberá, sú hlavne literárna teória, dekonštrukcia, psychoanalýza, kognitívne vedy alebo biosemiotika a samozrejme aj existenciálna semiotika. Hovorím preto samozrejme, lebo my sme mali tú čest privítať na 4 roky niekdajšieho riaditeľa tohto Medzinárodného semiotického inštitútu profesora Eva Tarastyho, ktorý je známy predstaviteľ existenciálnej semiotiky. Ako som spomínal, pôsobí v Slovenskej univerzite, kam sa vlastne tento Medzinárodný semiotický inštitút premiestnil z Kanady do Fínska, kde druhý čas pôsobil potom v Kaunase, kde ho viedol profesor Dario Martinelli a od minulého roka teda ho vedie James Bennett, mimochodom rodák do Sýtlu už 40 rokov. Musím spomenúť to, že jeho zásluhou sa organizovali v Tartu v semiotickom salóne, tzv. Semiosalong, ktoré sa preniesli teraz na pôdu Českej republiky a mimochodom veľmi zaujímavý YouTube semiotický kanál, jak som z jeho diel spomenul Second Generation Semiology and ad-hoc linguistic functions, alebo jeho monografiu, ktorá vyšla pred 2 rokmi Detotalizations and retroactivity Pyramid Semiotics, alebo prácu Incompatibility Limited Semiosis Aesthetic Function. Z tých ďalších veľmi zaujímavých štúdií, ktoré vlastne prezentujú dokladujú široký záber v oblasti nielen semiotiky, ale primárne je napríklad práca on the semiotic concept of ground, alebo concept for semiotics, respektíve skutočne veľmi zaujímavé biosemiotika je biolinguistic Chinese semiotic studies a uvedená alebo semiotic life cycle and symbolic species. Ešte predstavím jednu dnešnú prednášku, ktorej anotácia vlastne, ako ste sa mohli doznámiť už vopred. Chcem upozorniť aj na zajtrajšie podujatie, ktorým je komorné kolokvium So many insights of semiotics and philosophy of culture and art today. To sa uskutočnilo 9. hodine v Unikube v hlavnej budove našej univerzity. A kto by mal záujem, sú už nahľadnúť program aj abstrakty tohto podujatia tu na jednej z lavíc. Tak pozývam aj na toto podujatie, ktoré sa takisto súčasne jednak James Bennett, ako aj vedúca katedry všeobecnej lingvistiky Ľudmila Lacková, ktorú tu tiež vítam. Tá prednáška má veľmi zaujímavý názov, čo vidíte už aj z prvého slajdu, International Semiotics Module, Slovenská semiotická skupina. Ja nebudem opakovať všetky informácie z abstraktu, ale je veľmi zaujímavé pre mňa to, že v rámci interdisciplinárneho zamerania tohto cyklu v anotácii sa mohli dočítať, že to zameranie tohto inštitútu, ktoré sa do istej miery snaží profilovať originálnejšie, alebo novým spôsobom po Olomouci, zahrania Crossinter-multi a trans-disciplinaritu, intersectionalitu a multi-polaritu, lingvistickú a kulturálnu polyglottismus a tak ďalej, s tým, že za jednu z najdôležitejších podujatí už počas aspoň to tak už šefovania tohto inštitútu možno označiť International Semiotic Summer School v Prahe, ktoré sa konalo v lete tohto roka v Prahe. Takže pre mňa bude veľmi zaujímavé pre mňa i to, že riaditeľ inštitútu semiotiky sa mieli zamerať záver svojej prednášky aj na nejednoznačný pojem slovenskej semiotickej skupiny alebo skupín. že by si kladli otázky, kto sú jej najdôležitejší predstavitelia, či je to Niko, Popovič alebo iný, a čo sú vlastne tie hlavné, možno aj originálne témy slovenskej semiotiky. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very glad to introduce you, Director of International Semiotic Studies, Assistant Professor James Bennett, PhD, who will present this lecture, the General Semiotics module at Slovenská semiotická skupina.
Ďakujem. Veľmi sa mi tu páči. Správne? Dobre. Yes, thank you for the introduction, Yulo. As I think you mentioned in that brief introduction, we are here because of my somewhat recent appointment as the new director of the ISI, the International Semiotics Institute in Olomouc. And I tend to maybe speak too quickly or too colloquially sometimes with my English, and maybe also sometimes too quietly. If you're hard of hearing, then you just come a bit closer. Yeah. But I'll try to speak as clearly as possible. Yes. Our task at the ISI is to facilitate communication between the many semiotics affiliations and groups, because, as you may know, there's an overabundance of groups because of the many sub-disciplines of semiotics. And to that end, it is useful for us to proceed with some kind of at least functional or provisional model of general semiotics, yes? Principles shared between all the various applications. And this is a purely hypothetical or maybe even ad hoc approach because such model does not exist. All right? I mean, you'll find quite a bit of disagreement across the board, across the spectrum, between biosemiotics and cultural semiotics, for example, about what are the main principles, yeah? But so we have to proceed as though it did exist, this general semiotics. And thus, since my appointment, I have endeavored to elaborate some basic principles, which happen to pertain to communication, more to signification, and I'll explain what that means a little later. And the hope would be that these general principles extend or encompass all the applications and the domains, all the domains of semiotics, which includes Slovakia. The title might imply that I was attempting to delineate or to define Slovenská semiotická skupina. However, I understand that there's a multiplicity of Slovakian semiotics groups also, and so it's more of a proposal. And I decided yesterday perhaps I should call the semiotics that we're doing in Slovakia, perhaps we should call it Tatranská semiotika, something even more specific. But again, I'll explain why we might focus on the mountains as a symbol or a logo for our Slovakian semiotics, and how we might also derive certain more specific principles, modeling principles from the mountains, from the outdoors, from various principles which I will elaborate, that are specific to Slovakian semiotics, I think. But they do have to derive from the general principles, yeah? And these are the general principles, you saw them in my abstract probably. And not without some dispute. That is, they're by no means undisputed, and I've been working them and reworking them. And so, when I say that they pertain to communication more than to signification, that is, it's about groups, that is. It's about how to facilitate group interactivity, even to maximize or to prolong interactivity in a situation in which, in the digital era, oftentimes this interactions and communication as such is meant to be sidestepped or bypassed, or we should be able to automate a lot of the basic functions of communication. So in any case, so prolonging and maximizing interactivity works against this more instrumentalist information processing paradigm kind of mentality about automation. So the principles are cross-inter, multi, and trans-disciplinarity, intersectionality and inclusivity, multi-species, multi-polarity, linguistic and cultural polyglottism, not-for-profit, public access, self-reference, ad hoc modeling, and improvisation. I had one commentator at the gatherings in biosemiotics last year in Copenhagen kind of interrupt me. One of my more skeptical, I think, colleagues, Tyler, these principles seem a bit liberal, don't you think? And I was like, well, yes, especially with the gold star that almost resembles the European Union flag. And I admitted this to her. I think her main problem was with the fourth principle, which previously read open access, which of course is just a kind of platform for making more money. Yeah. And the idea with that fourth principle is just that we should try to minimize financial transaction when it comes to intellectual discourse, something with which she agreed completely. But also this intersectionality, inclusivity, and such as all the progressive values you usually hear from the liberal side. I understand this. But some of them also don't really work. Like I include here, I mean, that is, they don't work with like mainstream neoliberalism. I include here multi-polarity. For example, which refers to the political context, yeah. Not a single, there can be no single world power, for example, which definitely doesn't align with the neoliberal position. But in any case, we've been rehashing them for some time. And so by pertaining to communication, I guess our goal with these is to construct or to craft scenarios of high modeling capacity. Yes, constructing scenarios and events in which this meaningful transaction may take place, rather than focusing specifically on these like formal signification structures. I chose to do this when defining the general principles and to focus on communication because I think these indeed are the principles which extend to all the branches, whereas when it comes to sign definitions and other technicalities, there's almost no agreement. Yes. And these are sort of like the basic, the minimum of what I would expect from a group or from a scholar claiming to do semiotics. I would expect it to address most of these principles, or to show a concern for these principles, I guess. But we're not going to talk about all these principles today. We're going to focus on this one, because I think it's the most relevant for this notion of Slovakian semiotics. Self-reference in particular, yes, because it's unique in the way that it actually makes possible a method, I guess, a method of writing. And self-reference is particularly well illuminated by cyber semiotics, which is a different discipline, which I would, I think, contrast with my idea of Slovakian semiotics for several reasons, not the least of which are these characteristics of its technocratic, solipsistic, and unromantic attitude. And I don't want to get too bogged down in these principles of the cyber semiotic approach, other than to contrast it with this, my proposed Slovakian approach. In contrast, I think this Slovenská semiotická skupina, in my imagination at least, again this is a totally hypothetical entity in my imagination, but such a group would be maybe somewhat disinterested in technology, possibly, or at least less interested in questions of technology than cyber semiotics. Such a group would definitely be dedicated to the notion of intersubjectivity, that is the importance of group work and dialogue, as opposed to this solipsistic attitude that's common to cybernetics. Yes. And I would say probably also the Slovakian semiotics maybe entertains a more romantic attitude towards nature, or towards the possibility of reuniting with nature. Yes? That is, the Slovakian semiotics, in my imagination, is concerned with the outside, maybe with getting outside, not just with the outdoors, but also with the notion of an outside in the ontological sense. The accessibility or inaccessibility of the outside, like in the Derridean sense, getting outside of the text, and so on. Yes, the way I imagine Slovakian semiotics, it would be at least remain optimistic about the possibility of such things. And this maybe puts it in contrast with cybernetics and cybersemiotics. I mentioned cybersemiotics also because when it comes to the general principles of the ISI, I foreground cybersemiotics and cybernetics generally because of our committed interest in critical digital humanities, which is dedicated to technological questions and dedicated to the paradigm shift to life online, which I am not going to talk about today because, well, rather we're going to talk about it tomorrow in the symposium. That's going to be the time to talk about technology. And well, we're really interested in that at the Department of General Linguistics with computational linguistics and programming and digital humanities and such. But I see them as kind of opposed. Yes? But when it comes to self-reference, well, self-reference is common to both. Self-reference is kind of common across the board, I would say, in semiotics. And it does happen that cybernetics and information theory give us a kind of methodological approach to self-reference, which is lacking elsewhere. This is where cybernetics is, I think, indispensable. And this is why this slide exists in my presentation, because well, understanding self-reference is also crucial to our Slovakian semiotics, but we need a kind of technical understanding of it. And this is where the concept of re-entry comes in. And again, like I said, I don't want to get too bogged down in these technicalities. This is the most technical slide of the whole presentation. But we need to understand the functionality of self-reference as a method. Yes? Breer, he does a huge survey of first order and second order cybernetics, and he's really interested in this von Forster, among others, more familiar names, Maturana, Varela, etc. But it's in von Forster where he finds the best definition of re-entry, which has everything to do with this like self-reference. He writes here in the first quote, "The distinction between the system and its surroundings is the first act of cognition. If this difference is again introduced into the system, a conscious awareness of the observing is created when this difference is reflected in the system, and this is called re-entry." So this, I think, is close to what I consider to be like the central idea of the cyber-semiotic approach, which is that the presence of the outside is only registered as a disruption within the symbolic system. So here we're going from self-reference to solipsism. Yeah? This is where Breer maintains that the cybernetic approach is also essentially constructivist, socially constructivist. It's all about this purely observer-dependent construction of reality. And we have to assume that we have no access to the external. It's not that they, well, at least for Breer, it's not that they outrightly deny the existence of the external world. It's simply to say that the situation is such today that we confuse the representation with the reality, and that this confusion is ubiquitous. Yes? So the situation is so pressing, the representational situation, that we have to take these extremely solipsistic measures if we're interested in getting to the external. So we may say that these kind of structuralist or semiological or constructivist attitudes, which we think reject reality, are in fact the only way to get at this reality or this external. In the second phase of cybernetic evolution, a serious attempt was made to cope with the epistemological and the methodological propositions that appear if you begin seriously to include the observer in the descriptions of his observations. So the most simple example of this kind of like self-referential technique is in the postmodern, like in the American postmodern novels, which have all this kind of metatextual play. It's always a book about a book, or there's always some problematization of the relationship between the author and the narrator, And in these like 1990s era postmodern books, there was already kind of some anticipation of the explosion of the idea of the multiverse. Yes. And of course, many decry postmodernism as a kind of passing fad, as a stylistic fad or something like this. But rather, what we see now in the digital age, the full-blown digital age, is that this kind of concern for metatext and regress of metatextual levels, of descriptive levels, and of the loss of the original referent. That this thought of postmodernism was actually pretty keen anticipation of what was coming to us, you know, coming down on us because of social media and because of the ubiquity of recording, more or less. But so like the Pynchons, the Pynchons and the Don DeLillos and the David Foster Wallaces, that is the postmodern American novelists, were concerned to tell us that the only way we can get back to the external, get back to nature, get back to reality is to create a short circuit in the symbolic system, create a short circuit in the representational system, break it down, invite this regress and collapse of descriptive levels, and then maybe in the rupture we may catch a glimpse of the light coming from the external, the outside world, whatever it is that's out there, independent of our mediated experience of that, mostly digitally mediated experience of that reality. So this is something that they share, the cybernetics and cyber semiotics shares with semiology, particularly late semiology or second generation semiology, as I think Yulo mentioned in his introduction. That is the Jacques Lacan, Jacques Derrida, Julia Kristeva, etc. was this prognostication of a situation of an epistemic shift in which even the most basic words have to be redefined. Words like presence. This was the word that Derrida focused on. He said that in coming times of changes, epistemic shift, even words like presence will have to be redefined, because to say something like I am here no longer means what it used to mean. Yeah. In an obvious way. It's obvious to us now, with Zoom being the Zoomers that we are. Like, it's obvious to us that it doesn't mean the same thing anymore. It's also obvious that just because someone's physically present in the room with you doesn't necessarily mean they're present. Right? So, these are just keen insights from semiology, and I think from postmodernism, but also from cybernetics, about the loss of the referent, and also gives us some kind of like common principles, because cyber semiotics is this more technocratic but also scientifically informed and Peircean. I don't know if you know this Charles Sanders Peirce, but this is huge vogue in semiotics today of the Charles Peircean group, which is also more oftentimes associated with the scientific, naturalistic approach. And then on the other side now, there's this semiology and post-structuralism and deconstruction. And rarely do the two meet, you know. And this dispute, well, confronting this dispute is another major task of the ISI, but I would say that this concern for the epistemic shift of the paradigm shift to life online and the sort of depredations that come with it, this common interest that should be maintained, is basically the most important, probably, idea of general semiotics. So ultimately, they share the same concern. Let's say all the branches, but more specifically, like cybernetics and Slovenská semiotická skupina share a common concern which is this representational crisis and how to get around it, or how to mitigate the worst of its consequences. And this will be, I guess, the last bit about Breer, but I really like Soren Breer's book, which is called Cyber Semiotics: Why Information is Not Enough, because of his effort to make a distinction between information and meaning, to finally, draw this distinction, which I think is the fundamental distinction, particularly for biosemiotics. Sometimes the definition of information and definition of meaning kind of blend together, but if we understand the technical definition of information, and we can get a lot closer to prescinding what is really meant by meaning. And meaning is also more context dependent and pertains more to communication, which involves sender-receiver relations and channel and context, etc., whereas signification pertains to this more formalizable side. But anyway, the main point is just that Breer goes a long way to making the distinction between information and meaning. And I would say maybe that this Slovakian semiotics is more concerned with meaning. But I'll explain a little bit more about what that means. And this last quote is just a kind of reiteration of the allegedly solipsistic characteristic of cybernetics. At least for von Forrester, what Breer wants to do, because Breer brings in person, Breer does a lot of other stuff. He's interested in biosemiotics, and Breer wants to distance cybernetics from this hard solipsism, or this hard social constructivism. He wants to put some distance in there. FYI. So more information does not mean more meaning. This is obvious to us today, I think. It's in the same way that if someone is yelling in your face, right, with the volume, I guess, increased volume, it doesn't mean that their meaning is going to get across to you better, although it can. But this claim, more information does not mean more meaning, is something which is kind of alien, or we could say meaningless, to the analytic philosopher. Not to make any kind of straw man out of analytic philosophy, but let's say to the naive analytic philosopher who wants to say things about aesthetics and feeling, etc., or, well, we can't speak about them because they're non-quantifiable, that they're not measurable. And it also runs, I guess, a bit counter to contemporary rationale regarding the information processing paradigm, where no one's going to dispute the power of computational tools for measuring information, quantities of information. That's another reason I like Breer, though, is because he's pretty keen to this dilemma epistemic shift related to technologies of communication and information, and that he creates this nice little label, I guess, for describing the kind of technocratic capitalistic mentality. Well, I guess it's a technocratic mentality and an acquisitive mentality, which kind of dovetail and accelerate each other in late postmodernism, as he describes. And anyway, he gives a real persuasive kind of semiotic treatment of it without delving into Marx, and really without delving into postmodernism. And this is another reason why I think it's incredibly useful, because it's actually, well, but it may not even be enough to say that more info does not mean more meaning. In fact, we may go even a step further, as some have done, to suggest that there maybe is even an inverse ratio or inverted proportion between informational capacity and modeling capacity or meaning. Now here I introduce the word modeling as if it meant the same as meaning, which would probably meet with some dispute, but let's just say, for the sake of the argument, that they are the same. Some have asserted that that modeling capacity or meaning is actually decreased proportionally to informational capacity, right? And this is a kind of a counterintuitive idea. More information, less meaning, or more information, less modeling. Whatever it is, this modeling and its distinction from information, this is precisely the interest of semiotics, of course. Whatever it is not measurable, at least not in terms of quantity, and it can't be described. It may be able to be described formally, but it cannot be described algebraically. That's what I mean by quantities, and that's why we have a measurement problem with regard to this. But in any case, modeling capacity and meaning are always a concern of communication, and thus always context dependent. So in a sense, to some extent, non-formalizable, and so do not yield like upscalable results, does not yield, like an interest in this modeling and meaning is not conducive to maximizing outputs, or certainly not conducive to monetizing outputs. And here we're thinking of the academic context, of course. It's clear why the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, for example, is not as profitable, yes. But our inability to draw this distinction puts us in a serious problem as humanist scholars when we're trying to make an argument for why our department needs a comparable kind of funding. It's a different issue. But interestingly, this idea about the inverted relationship between information and meaning comes from cybernetics, but from Soviet cybernetics, and Breer does not refer to any of the Soviet thinkers. I'm thinking particularly of few individuals. In fact, Ivanov and Toporov were not cyberneticians per se. The book is this book, Soviet Semiotics. Fantastic anthology by Lucy. Not all that well frequently read. Actually, in their book, in this article, particularly this article, Structural Typological Study of Semiotic Modeling Systems, the argument is that it's, in fact, religious modeling systems that have the highest modeling capacity, and they're kind of throwing shade at the purely linguistic modeling systems, which to their mentality are kind of closer to informational structures, closer to like formal structures than rather the religious ones. If we think of religious modeling systems, what they may mean by that, I think we can at least say that there's certainly something more theatrical about them, and religious modeling situation, a church situation, is a multimedia situation, definitely. It's certainly a interpersonal situation. There's a lot of communication happening in that building. It's simultaneously iconic and symbolic and indexical. It's transdisciplinary, of course. We can kind of see why the religious modeling system, in their view, is like high modeling capacity in comparison with, say, a text. But of course, there's also the fact of in their context, their semiotics was a mode of resistance to Marxism, to Soviet Marxism, and to the prohibition of religion. Of course, these czarist semioticians, you may call them, shouldn't call them that, but so why they would want to valorize the religious modeling system particularly could be disputed. In any case, I think it's an effective example. But these are the quotes. These quotes pertain to this inverted relation between information and modeling capacity or meaning. And the first quote: various semiotic systems possess diverse modeling building rules. Moreover, the higher the system's model building function, the harder it is to formalize it. As from The Role of Semiotics in the Cybernetic Study of Man. And the second quote, again, this article is infamous, difficult. It's a difficult article. Probably there's some translation issue, but I don't know. Anyway, the quote is: the problem of classifying semiotic systems by their degree of modeling capacity can be singled out from this circle of questions. So I think of the manger scene. Everyone knows what that is, right? There's the baby Jesus, and there's some animals, and the Magi, I guess, and there's a star in a farm. I don't know, like, okay. So people create them in their yard, right? At their church or in their family yard, yes, and they build plastic, whatever, with some Christmas lights. And it's kind of like a diorama, or what we called a diorama in primary school. When I discussed a diorama with Ludmila, and you guys call it ikebana. Is she right about this? It's like a Japanese word or something. But why is it? So I might argue, following this logic, I might argue that the diorama is an exceptionally high modeling capacity sign, let's say, or message. Well, why is that? Well, you could say the same things about as I just said about the religious modeling system, and the fact of its multimodality, etc. But I would say even a little bit more about the diorama. In primary school, the basis of the diorama, when you get that assignment, you have to use what's at hand. So it's ad hoc modeling, it's improvisational modeling. There are definite constraints imposed by the context, yes. But something else is being modeled here. That is, the teacher learns something about the living situation of the child, like on the basis of the diorama. Yeah. So of course, if there are no restrictions about what to use for the diorama, then you can just buy the diorama or whatever. But based on this restrictions and limitations on the medium imposed by the restrictions of the medium or by the channel, we learn something else. And this is something we learn about modeling generally, is that in the increased modeling situation, and remember, of course, it's artistic modeling systems are the ones that old Yuri Lotman and the others were really interested in. They wanted to valorize literature and the arts. So if we think about an artistic modeling system as a relatively high modeling capacity system, as compared with a more technical text, in which there should be, in the technical text, there should be, I guess, closer to one-to-one relationship between sender and receiver, in the sense that we want a minimum of ambiguity. We are hoping not for much translation to be happening in this transmission. We want definite response, predictable outcome of the sending of this transmission in a technical text, but with an artistic text rather. There's a wide variety of possible responses. And you may even say in some cases, like, the artistic mentality is in some way to cede control over the interpretation to the receiver, or to a number of different constraints. And how you go about this opening of the meaning, this release of control of the meaning, well, it varies widely between artists, and of course, whether or not this release of control is even a part of the artistic aesthetic is a question of what your aesthetic school is. It happens that the school of aesthetics that was popular at this time was very much about randomization and freeing, death of the author, freeing the artistic message to receptivity, reception theory, etc., etc. But anyway, if we take that aesthetic theory, if we accept that aesthetic theory, this participative aesthetic theory, we may say that one condition of a high modeling capacity system is that the question of what is being modeled becomes more ambiguous. So in the case of the diorama, part of what is being modeled is indeed the home life of the child. So there's some loss of control when it comes to this high modeling capacity systems. So I've mentioned religious modeling systems, and I've mentioned artistic text, poetry, etc., and I've mentioned the diorama, but coming around eventually to the idea of maps, I guess, as a kind of middle. It's a text, well, I don't know, computation is way over here, and then maybe like instructive texts, and kind of artistic written texts still, and then maybe spoken texts. Anyway, there's some kind of spectrum. But the maps, I guess maps are kind of, it depends, maybe poetry. In any case, there's a higher degree of modeling capacity in a map than there is in a technical text. And this is for the same reasons as with the religious modeling systems and with the dioramas. It's because of the combination of the spatiality, the visuality, and the multimodality of a map somehow manages to capture this excluded middle, or we may call them these disjunctive propositions, or in any case, some kind of content/meaning which is excluded by more analytical approaches. And we can understand in a very simple way, if we think about maps as diagrams, we can see how in a pretty simple way the little ambiguities and spaces, I guess, little open spaces in every map or in every diagram are where that freedom is represented. Freedom of interpretation is more or less represented within the map. And this is why Friedrich Sternfeld refers to all maps as diagrams, and talks about the skeletal nature of diagrams, how within every diagram there's a space for you to reinsert some new data, and based upon the transformations of the diagram, you're always going to get a new result, a different result. So this is about the manipulation of the diagram. A kind of freedom of manipulation which is less present in more formalized systems, which ideally are geared towards producing a more predictable result. So here with the diagram logic, Frederick's trying to, and he's a famous Danish cognitive scientist and semiotician and linguist, probably an important figure anyway. And a book's called Diagrammatology. And in the book, his best example comes from metro maps. And I will explain the logic of diagram transformations in the context of a metro map. But before that, the fact that the diagram displays the interrelation between the parts of the object it depicts is what facilitates its use in reasoning and thought processes, thus taking the concept of sign far from the idea of simple coding and decoding and to the epistemological issues of the acquisition of knowledge through signs. The example, and this is right in the introduction of the book, and the example he gives, of course, Pythagorean theorem, which most of us know in terms of the sort of algebraic equation, but which can be understood diagrammatically as well. And we understand how if we replace the central triangle with its triangles of different sizes, we yield different results, and thus the manipulatability of the diagram, the freedom of the diagram, afforded by the diagram. Frederick's notion of diagrams is quite broad. He would even refer to propositions as diagrams, and so it becomes kind of complicated, but best example comes from metro maps. Here's a map of Copenhagen. My friend, I've been talking about maps a lot because, well, for whatever reason, I'll come back to it, but my friend, expert in semiology, who works alongside us at the Department of General Linguistics, he teaches phonology and introduction to general linguistics and so on, and he posed the question quite directly to me. Okay, in the case of a map, then, you think the map is the perfect example of modeling system, then what is the content plane of the map? As you know, over here on the board here, there are many sign models. I'll adopt Echo's version just because it's the most suitable for general semiotics, but we have an expression plane and a content plane. When they're joined, the expression plane is the signifier and the content plane is signified, yeah? So the expression plane is the word image, if we're talking about language, or acoustic image, yeah? And the content plane is this like mental image, yeah? Or concept, I guess as it's sometimes called. And in a sign, so the expression and content are what they are when separate, but when joined, this creates the sign, and that's what makes signifier signified. That's what we have here. And you ask me, well, what is in the case of a map, well, what's the content plane? How do you separate the content plane from the expression plane? Well, I mean, if we look at the metro map, obviously there are a set of conventional signifiers, and these are language-like conventional signifiers in the sense almost no variability, yes. Of course, the names of the stops are these like signifiers, yes. And so, for example, the name of Christianhaven as a signifier corresponds to Christianhaven as a place. If you've never been to Christianhaven, you don't know what it looks like, so your mental representation is somewhat impoverished, but it doesn't really matter. But of course, what the content plane is going to be is it's going to also depend upon the globality of the frame. That is, there are all sorts of composite signs happening here, so we can take signifiers in isolation, like these individual words, or these little icons that name the tracks, You can take them in isolation. Obviously, M3 as a signifier refers to the actual circular track, the red track. However, if we take them as composite signs, that is, we could take an entire line, this whole circular line, for example, as a composite sign. So, as a signifier, it refers to the whole line. Every sign can be dealt with independently in this way, but it doesn't really yield anything. So, thinking about it, of course, coming all the way around. Well, the content plane of the map, the metro map, is a set of possible instructions, of course, to answer certain questions. Like, if I want to go from Pheasant Road to Christianshavn, one thing I learned about this as a prohibitive lesson is that I can't get there just by the green line. You know, I've got to get off the green line at Northgate and then get on the blue line and go south 4 stops, and then I'm at Christianshavn. Yes, and these are instructions, possible instructions. And so some of them are implicit in the map, and some are explicit. Like, some are included in the map and some are not included. And so if you see the red expression and content are joined by means of the creation of a sign. Yeah. So there can be signs in the map which are already created, and then there are signs which are yet to be created. And interpretant from Prof is an idea that's meant to refer to the creation of new correlations between expression and content. And Frederick's point is that on these maps and diagrams like this, there is even a place made for the new correlation. And we can just talk about the spaces, basically, the absences, and what is not directly mentioned. Basically, the space of the interpretant is represented by the diagram in terms of its exclusions and gaps. And this is the way that for Frederick, maps or diagrams, they do surpass some of the purely linguistic alternatives. But what's brought me to maps, the reason why I was talking about maps so obsessively with my colleague is not because of metro maps, although I do quite like the design of the Copenhagen metro map. It's pretty cool, but it's because of ski maps. That's why. People ask me recently, why semiotics of Slovakia? Why are you interested in this Slovenská, semiotická, skupina? You're not Slovakian and so on, but this is part of the 5th principle of general semiotics about ad hoc modeling. For me, Slovakia is simply what's at hand. Right? We spend a lot of time in Slovakia, and that's it, because I like to ski. So we've been just going to Tatras, and that's the principle of ad hoc modeling. Use what's available, because by using what's available, you impose a constraint upon your representation, and by consciously negotiating this constraint, somehow you make new contact with the external. So, in the case of ski maps, there's a lot that's included and a lot which is excluded. This is Vratna. As you can see, has anyone been to Vratna? Okay. Terchova. Have you been to Terchova? Yes? Okay. Good. We were there just last weekend. Much is included on this map, and much is excluded. This has a lot to do with what they want you to do with the map, and what they want you not to do, basically. And another thing to think about with maps, this is kind of a trip, and it relates also to the critical digital humanities, is we think this is an icon. It looks like a mountain. Right? There's kind of similarity relation, and we can talk about the pure conventionality of the signifiers in the map, inside the map, like the compass or the flags or the little chairlift symbols. But we would treat the rest of the map on a whole, we would treat it in terms of the similarity relation. Probably it looks like a mountain. It's kind of green. It has some kind of dimensionality, etc. But on a whole, rather, it's just another conventional sign. That is, like the imaginary experience that we have when engaging with this map is entirely dependent upon our familiarity with similar maps, or that is, with similar locations. To have a really robust imaginative repertoire of the map, you have to have been there, basically, or have been to a number of places that are quite similar or comparable. And these memories are what fill out the map. But someone who's never been to a mountain reserve is not going to see the same thing. Not at all. And in this way, it is not purely, but again, largely conventional. Well, let's think about it. How similar is this to a mountain? I mean, it's two-dimensional, first of all. I mean, well, there are no similarities, basically. It's purely conventional. But this is a point from Eco, though, I guess, Umberto Eco, in his famous critique of the notion of iconism and indexicality, which we will not discuss today. But it's important to visit in order to use maps. You have to have some practical experience. I would also say, before going on, that we can also talk about the ideological mapping in the sense of exclusion and inclusion. It's all about instructions, and the people who design the map have very specific ideas about what they want you to do and what they do not want you to do. And so, for example, this is the main gondola. It's up here. This is some pretty respectable terrain. But you see there's no, for example, these are the downhill tracks. This is an intermediate track, you can see, which is marked by the fact of it being red. But over here, there's no track, you see? It says, oh, they don't want you to go over there. But we can see, if we consult a different mapping option, you know. Indeed, we can take the alternative route. This is the same lift. This is an app called FatMap. It's pretty cool. But they're ideological mapping, you know, they don't want me to hit the dangerous terrain, but I'm probably gonna anyway. But sometimes we need ideology because, you know, things like avalanches and so on, they also happen. Another nice thing about mapping is, as I said, you know, in order to use a map, you have to have some kind of personal experience with, if not with this terrain, then with similar terrain. And you kind of creatively and unconsciously, you flesh out, in your imagination, you flesh out a given representation such as this on the basis of your personal repertoire of experiences. And so if we include mapping, I guess, in addition with softness and quietness, include mapping as a principle of Slovakian semiotics, then there's also some kind of implication about location, about the importance of location. And you can see already why location is important for communication. Communication is always dealing with scenarios and events and context. And so you cannot have a scenario, an event, or a context without a location, right? We are very fortunate, Professor Huyak, Dr. Latskola, and myself are having many great teachers, and some of whom have set a great example for us with regard to this tradition of outdoor meetings, and maybe even claiming that a proper semiotic meeting has to have some kind of locality, or that locality should be really stressed if, as semioticians, we want to create a situation in which there's a maximum modeling capacity situation, yeah? So we got to think about where we meet. And we're very fortunate for the fact that some of our teachers are also into this. Thinking about Eero right now, of course. Eero Tarasti, Professor Eero Tarasti from Helsinki, former director of the International Semiotics Institute, and friend of ours. He always put emphasis upon this. And he used to have his seminars in Imatra for many years. And here we are. We gave some presentations for his meeting of the Finnish Semiotic Society last December. And being the very cordial host that he is, he also took us to art exhibition of the Finnish artist Akseli Galila, late 19th century. Fabulous exhibition at the National Museum. And I think between the Finnish Semiotic Society and the hypothetical Slovenská semiotická skupina, or better yet, Tatranská semiotika, there are some common interests. I think common themes maybe we can learn from the Finns in this regard. Many common interests. Simple. Here are these cross-country skiers on top. I'll get back to why snow in particular, its softness, and particularly the way that it dampens sound. If you're in the backcountry, you know how that trees get caked with snow. And if you're in an alleyway of trees, it's like the weirdest silence. But I'll come back to why snow and silence are important. But in this case, only skiing is important. We may share this. Oh, one emblem of the Finnish semiotics, which we probably cannot appropriate because of their kind of exclusive proprietary relationship with particular symbols, the sauna, of course. But they do not have exclusive proprietary relation with the sauna as a symbol of semiotics. This they also share with the Estonians. Yes. To repeat maybe what Julo already said. My former supervisor at Kalevikko was Estonian. And he is another great proponent of the outdoor meeting. But also in his writings, he has this kind of minimalist, like Zen koan-esque kind of approach. He doesn't like these very complicated Persian typologies, endless details, technicalities. He is not interested in the technicalities so much. He is more interested in hashing out basic definitions of design, basic methodological approaches and rules. And he's also a kind of guy who, like, if you speak at too much length to him, particularly in English, if you speak too quickly or at too much length, he just goes, he blocks it all out anyway. But this has to do with his minimalism. I only mention him because he's another one of the teachers of us for which we were very fortunate, because he taught us about why the location is so important. They love their coastline. These are some semioticians in the wild, and as an emblem of Estonian semiotics, certainly the coastline is a very, very nice one. And that location where that photo was just taken was in Putu, which is here. Or no, it's here. Here. Check it out. But I think personally, and I'll be wrapping up in 2 slides. Coastline is a nice emblem for semiotics, it's fine. However, I will mention here the limits of this romanticism, right? Like what I'm promoting here, what I'm proposing is, like, if we are careful about the location of our meeting, then somehow we can perhaps maximize the modeling situation and have a more meaningful experience, like with this concern for nature. Basically, this sounds a bit naive, or it sounds a bit romantic, and indeed it is. And this kind of romanticism, this kind of naive romanticism, is quite uncritical in the philosophical sense, certainly, and thus unsemiotic, at least to the extent that we may say that semiotics is indeed a critical philosophy, basically, or that it derives from critical philosophy, starting from Kant. Of course, many are going to disagree that semiotics is critical philosophy, but in any case, to adopt a really naively romantic realism about union with nature and so on is kind of unsemiotic, so it has to be mentioned. Well, coastline is a nice, easygoing place. The bogs, Kalevikul's bogs, that's the bog, right? It's a very easygoing kind of place. It doesn't seem, there's nothing intrinsic to this symbolism which might draw our attention to the limits of romanticism, and thus, this is why I think we may find some better symbols in the Slovakian context, right? Particularly, I think, from the Tatras, because there's something menacing about the Tatras, as they are represented here in this fabulous diorama. Well, the idea here is just that there are certain dangers of romanticism, and perhaps for an ecologically oriented semiotics should be more focused on ecological catastrophe. at the impossibility of reunion with nature, with lost nature. There's something kind of cool about the diorama as well, in the way that it captures the industrial context of the Tatras. In fact, this is a town near Banska Bystrica. It means it's Niske Tatry, lower Tatras, I think. We were discussing it last night. So it's not the high Tatras, although it looks like the high Tatras. But at this coal mining town nearby Banska Bystrica is, as far as I understand it, the Tatras, the high Tatras themselves are also kind of beset in an industrial context that is across the border into Poland. There are quite a bit of factories, which is interesting. And also, I gotta hurry up. I'm gonna wrap up. But Ticha Dolina, for example, the most well-preserved and oldest natural wildlife in all of Europe, interestingly, is also kind of beset, very perilously near to these industrial factories, and thus the Tatras on the whole, kind of nice, like symbolism for Slovenská semiotická skupina. Because it will remind us of the limits of the romantic union with nature. So to draw towards the conclusion, does anyone know where these pictures were taken, besides Ludmila? You know Yulo? He does. Does anyone else know? Anyway, none other than Slovenské muzeum mám. Yes. I propose this to be the unofficial headquarters of the Tatranská semiotika. Don't miss it. So I would not attempt to define by any means, and this is basically my final slide. Presentation has not been an attempt to define or to demarcate the limits or boundaries of Slovakian semiotics, but to invite, principally, I guess, to the ISI, but also to an event, I think perhaps could be considered to be the first official event of Tatranská semiotika, which will be next summer, I'll mention in a moment. Also to promote the activities of the ISI in Slovakia, and to promote specific research groups which we have from operating in the ISI, which are mostly students, many of which are Slovakians. Ludmila tomorrow will tell you more about her particular research group in digital writing. So let's promote these groups and our activity there, and on the forthcoming activities of our incursions, our upcoming incursions into the Slovakian context, to invite you to join us. And to maybe try to, I guess part of this has been to also to flesh out those general principles that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, is ad hoc modeling, self-reference, and improvisation. Flesh them out like in a more specific context, that is in the Slovakian context. And so these principles, that is themes and symbols that I'm about to lay out on this slide, are I think derived almost entirely from that fifth point, that is ad hoc, improvisation, and self-reference. But these are the principles that I find, or the themes of Slovakian semiotics. I think softness is probably the best because, well, we never get away from linguistics and semiotics. But you can see how this principle of softness reflects this idea about the inverted relationship between information and meaning. So sometimes the quiet voice is going to be the one which actually is more effective, possibly. But we can explain this in a scientific manner. That's what's quite unusual about the semiotic approach. It can be done. But I think the Slovakian semiotics is going to put a very high premium on this kind of soft-spokenness. Obviously mapping. And then the dark romantic edge, I think, or the claim which I maintain that if we are going to entertain reunion with nature, the possibility of union with nature and high modeling capacity, these ideas, that we also have to include the more menacing and problematic aspects of that in order, well, basically in order to prevent semiotics from regressing to a kind of pre-critical realism, which in fact does happen, which is surprising considering the origins of semiotics. It's strange that it could happen, but it does happen. So that's why our romanticism is always dark. A couple symbols, tatra, fatra, matra, snow tracks, the Argyle path. I'm not going to explain this beyond the fact that, you know, Argyle is common on ski sweaters and socks. But it comes from this kind of embodied cognitive notation that was formulated by Jamin Pelkey, who's president of the International Association of Cognitive Semiotics. So it's all about this movement from tortured isolation to ideological binds in the form of the hourglass, to this kind of transcendent overcoming of ideological binds in the form of the rhombus, and then finally to the Argyle pattern, which is about intersubjective linking with others, almost like on the skin path on the ski track, the cross-country track. Maybe if you're going uphill, you got one, and then the next, climbing the rope. This is what the Argyle path is supposed to be about. I highly recommend Jamin's book, though, if you're interested in cognitive approaches. And I think Ticha Bolina is almost too perfect symbol. And as I said, I'd like to invite you to this, only just now, just decided about the date, first International Semiotic Summit. I wanted to talk to you about our summer school a little bit because it was awesome and huge. And I argue that it was most important event in semiotics in the last 10 years. You might get some dispute, but mostly because, you know, because there are a lot of events in semiotics, big ones. Like we were both in Thessaloniki, all three of us were in Thessaloniki last year, and of course 600, 700 people, you know, all the experts are there. But not all that many students. You get a bit worried when it's just a bunch of old folks, because like, who are going to be the next generation of semioticians, right? Who's going to carry it on? Anyway, at our summer school, it was an explosion of student interest. I wanted to talk to you about that because I wanted to contrast it with the Semiotic Summit. Semiotic Summit's going to be invitation only, well, RSVP only, in an isolated location to be announced. Tomorrow I'll talk to you more about the technocratic vision of this cyber-semiotic culture research unit. Most of this talk has been about communication, but we'll return to the technicalities tomorrow. Ďakujem mnohokrát.
Well, if I could, I hope that that to say that the Slovak tradition is a romantic tradition, well, in semiotics, taking the basis of the text of Niko, Popovic, or another authors, well, I don't think that there was a need as provocation. That there was a need as something as deep impression, but as something like Derrida's provocations. Why? Because there is no mountain semiotics in these writings. There is working with the interface between text and its possibilities of interpretation in the communication with another culture, in Popovich, or the semiotics of music in Faltin, yes, or in Jan Albrecht. So, well, my question was, in which text and which passage is based this construction? Saying that the Slovak tradition is romantic, yes, and I think for me it was the seeking of the freedom where there was no possibility to go outside physically, but the models, there seems to me, the semiotic model seems to me very, very open and global, changing in Nico's case, yeah?
I'm very eager to read more of Nico. Actually, I'd never even heard of him before. Yulo was very careful to text me before my presentation. You better mention these authors. Yes. Which was important for my learning process. But I did read enough to learn that I don't know if it was Popovich or the other guy who was doing semiotics of translation. Which one? Popovich? Yeah. And I think here, and he was influenced by the Tartu Moscow school as well. Popovich? It's got to come from Lotman, this translatability, untranslatability, and so on. Yeah. Thought of mentioning something perhaps about this premium on linguistic and cultural polyglottism, but I'd be completely out of place to accuse either Popovich or the other guy of romanticism, given my failure to read them. But
to make some progression is a good thing. It's opening work, it's not final.
Yeah.
I think.
There's a lot of translations available of these authors into English.
There's a few, there are some, but a few. As I know, some texts are translated but not monographs in now. It's the same situation with the Falcon, which most of this was in the German language, and until now it's not just a few churches, so it's complicated. Why?
And thank you for the question.
It's okay. And for me, it was very interesting that I know that your PhD was Professor Karikou because semiotics is the one of maybe the best science for any kind of modeling system, how to explain and describe it and research it. Because you often use this term modeling
yeah.
For meaning and I like also this subtitle of the semiotics of the book. I didn't remember about the Solomon period. The information is enough. I don't know if you know the Frank Zappa from the sentence that information is not knowledge. Knowledge is not wisdom. Wisdom is not love. Love is not music. Music is the best. And I like this the sequence that the information could not be enough for knowledge, and knowledge is not enough for real wisdom. And it's to say in other words, what you describe, we describe that more information, less modeling meaning. Especially in the time of social media, internet, you know what I'm talking about. On the other side, that this artistic interest, the artistic model system, open realist control, open much of possibilities, but this artistic modeling system needs much more time to devote, to pay attention. But it's not enough now. We have just instant web communication almost everywhere. My question is to the other point that you mentioned this ideological mapping. Can we perceive as a semiotic or aesthetic metaphor? I mean, aesthetic metaphor, what is included and excluded intentionally in a different culture or political situation? Ideological mapping.
Well, depends on whether you think ideology can be non-linguistic, I guess. So it depends on the scope of the definition of ideology. I mean, but by metaphor, I assume you mean metaphor pejoratively, as people tend to use metaphor, mere metaphor. Yeah, it's a metaphor, yes. Also about modeling, though, this problem of the word modeling. I wouldn't even have touched modeling if it weren't for old Zilizniak, you know, because he uses the word modeling, and they had to use modeling because of the prohibition of semiotics, as you know. But modeling has a kind of instrumentalist, kind of scientific tone, at least to it. It comes more from cybernetics, and I don't think it's quite suitable. I avoid the term almost completely in my dissertation model. I prefer description, and it has its own problems, but.
So this section is open. Remarks, comments, questions, reactions, reports.
So it was very interesting, this remark of there is nothing outside, there is nothing real outside us. Yes? Well, it is not what Immanuel said that. We have only phenomena, but this phenomena, this is our interaction, our interface with the reality that don't depend on us. We can mingle, we can mix our impression with facts, but that's not science. Well, the science does distinguish these things. They are part of something bigger, yes. We cannot know nothing that is not already phenomena, yes? But we know that there are things that are phenomena because they have the possibility to become phenomena. Well, so to say that can we understand this, that there is nothing outside as also a provocation sign that our models, us, and the world as one, like to understand it as one in the sense of anti-classical antiquity, as something wrong, complete, yes, but we are only, yes, fragments of this all, yes? And our self-reference is basis of our science. Well, it is not also a provocation to say there is nothing outside.
Well, I mean, even Soren Breer doesn't make the claim. I mean, he would actually try to take cyber semiotics and distance it from that solipsism. But certainly not this embodied tradition either of cognitive semiotics or certainly not biosemiotics. They're quite dedicated and interested in the external. But for myself, I'm actually quite interested in this purely observer-dependent construction of reality as a system, and in making some kind of claim that if we're really interested in getting at what's outside, then we have to be even more skeptical, epistemologically skeptical, about the tools by which we make this access. And the natural science does not provide us with a sufficient tool set for doing so.
But the language makes us the capacity to speak about things that really we don't we know nothing about the existence, but physical can have no physical existence. For example, mathematical objects, they really doesn't exist physically, but they are very useful in our everyday life. So we make these assumptions, and it's good to know that these things are outside physical reality, but not outside our reality. They are, well, it's a real thing for us.
Yes.
As a construct.
I would take this opportunity to stress the point that the commonplace reception of postmodernism and of deconstruction and of post-structuralism is that they are nihilist solipsists and they reject the existence of the external world. And this is absolutely not the case, or at least not for the best of them. And certainly not for Derrida, and certainly not for Julia Kristeva. These people were we're dedicated to the external and to sensory motor affect and drive and emotion and passion and the reality of these things. It's just that they were highly skeptical, and they foresaw a situation in which we would begin to confuse the representation for the reality, and thus we need to adopt very strict, very specific measures. If we really are so dedicated to getting at the discourse-independent reality, then we must double down on our own skepticism about our tools and and the accessibility and describability of this supposed external referent. But in this way, it's just a continuation of critical philosophy, a continuation of Kant, as he was saying.
Well, so if there's nothing from the audience, we thank you again to Intelligence Bennett for his lecture and for discussion.
Děkuji.
Insights of semiotics and philosophy of culture and art today, culture and art which take place tomorrow at 9:12 a.m. in Olomouc. December 20 in the Semiotic schools and except James Bennett, the speakers will be Dr. Laskova, and me, and as I said at the beginning, the move was interesting in abstracts. They are available here. So thank you very much. All